ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, has done it again. Trove of records has been revealed on how politicians and official figures evaded taxes through offshore tax havens. The financial secrets of politicians, billionaires, and the global elite included the likes of the former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, in which it revealed that he avoided paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at why this practice of avoiding taxes using offshore tax havens continues and why authorities have failed to stop it.
It's being described as the Panama Papers of 2016 on steroids. The Pandora Papers, a leak of almost 12 million documents allegedly linking some of the world's richest and most powerful to huge secret assets, tax avoidance, and money laundering. It's the job of hundreds of journalists in more than 100 countries, spending months combing through files as part of the largest ever global financial investigation. Among their findings, secret financial dealings of the King of Jordan, President of Russia, the President of Kenya, and hundreds more politicians and celebrities, some of whom allegedly use shell companies to buy properties here in the UK.
Oxfam have calculated that the amount concerned comes to some $427 billion lost to national economies and tax around the world. Money could be spent on hospitals, schools, all the things that the masses of the people need, especially as we come out of this global pandemic and the economic crisis that has spawned.
One of the two British names so far in the revelations, former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who allegedly avoided paying hundreds of thousands in property tax on a townhouse while buying the company which owned it.
And this is a guy, Blair, who never tires of going around the world telling other people how they should live their lives. He's treated as an elder statesman in British politics. The media had never done having him on their show to give his views on all the issues of the day. A man who's got the blood of 1 million Iraqis and more in the region on his hand.
The other Briton named Mohammed Amersi, a major Conservative Party donor who funded Boris Johnson's campaign to become Prime Minister, involved in one of Europe's biggest corruption scandals. The UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak has promised an investigation into the revelations, but when asked whether he was ashamed that London is a haven for those looking to get out of paying their fair share, he said he was not.
He himself is a former top executive with Goldman Sachs, so he's plugged into this kind of thing. He knows it goes on. I'm sure sotto voce, he would say that's part and parcel of the game.
Some are now questioning whether the UK is doing enough to regulate the use of shell companies and tax avoidance measures. Analysts say this makes it harder for citizens to trust their leaders.
For now, those allegations in the so-called Pandora Papers are, well, allegations. There's no proof that any of the individuals mentioned in this story broke any laws. But whether those laws will have to change is something that the public will have to debate and decide. Saeed Puriza, Press TV, London.
Our guest joining us for this edition of The Spotlight, historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling, joins us from Bristol. And we also have journalist and political analyst John Bosnitch, who joins us from Belgrade. Okay, I'd like to welcome you both. And let me first start with you, John Bosnitch, and ask you if you can, for people who may not know what this is all about in terms of the revelations, what tax evasion is, what offshore tax havens are they legal, are they not, and what it is that these politicians, billionaires, and official figures have actually done.
Well, it's definitely a complicated web. And the purpose of these havens is to deceive the tax inspection authorities of the home countries of the politicians and persons involved. The real reason for these havens is not just to avoid taxes. If it were just an accounting matter about how much money the individual politicians and other powerful individuals owe to their state governments, that would be another matter. The real reason that this is such a scandal is that the purpose of the tax havens is to hide the existence of the money. And the reason that the existence of the money is being hidden is because much, if not all of the money, comes in the form of bribery. That's the issue at heart of this problem.
Okay, now you've opened another door here. So let me get back to you on the bribery thing and ask you, Tony Gosling, if you can explain to us the depth of what this is so we can get an idea for those who may not have even heard of what has occurred. Because we're looking at pretty large figures, 330 politicians, high-level public officials in more than 90 countries. You could probably tell us better.
Well, you know what? I think it's interesting to see who is in this list, because, the likes of Rishi Sunak, he's saying, oh, well, we're going to have an investigation, the British Chancellor. But he's the sort of individual that could actually be using some of these techniques to hide his own wealth. And certainly that's the sort of thing he would have been coached to do at Goldman Sachs. So I'm a little bit cautious when I see a big leak like this. Blair, for example, is a major figure. But this is the sort of thing that everybody is doing. It's not, in a way, not news. If it was a criminal offence that he'd been committing, then it would be. But many, many wealthy and powerful people are doing this sort of thing all the time, de rigueur. And it is actually part of a sort of almost a secret club of the super rich, the super wealthy that get on and do this. And there's a lot of people, I think, that are not on this list that may well be up to these kind of techniques. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of political leaders, a lot of celebrities, names which, many people will recognise. But what about those names that people wouldn't recognise? Big business leaders, for example, from the pharmaceutical industry, the likes of Bill Gates, for example, using these sorts of techniques. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that there's a tremendous amount of discretion at the Washington, D.C. based ICIJ that's released all this as to who they dob in and which documents they release, or whoever's leaked it to them, and who they don't. So, yes, it's obviously something needs to be done about the massive amount of tax avoidance going on in offshore jurisdictions. And many of these, of course, are British overseas territories, for example. But then Switzerland is an enormous great one. It's very difficult to know how these sorts of places can actually be closed down as tax havens without international agreement. And this, of course, is another side to all of this is there going to be ever some sort of international agreement? There's a lot of push for it at the moment. In fact, Rishi Sunak himself has been saying this, that we've got to have some sort of agreement. And this is a further push. But I'm a little bit suspicious when I see that certain very powerful and important names, for example, people involved in the British royalty, do not appear to be on this list, and yet these are the sorts of techniques that what they would have been using regularly. Also, we've got to look at the funding for these sorts of big journalistic organisations. Now, you would have thought, for example, with hundreds of journalists working on a topic, that there are all sorts of, for example, dodgy deals in the arms trade that these journalists may have and should have found out. But no, they're handed all this information. And this organisation, the ICIJ, in a way, is a sort of competitor to WikiLeaks. Remember, Julian Assange now has done 10 years in jail. And I just did have a look to see what they had to say about Assange. And actually, there was an article by Yossi Melman, who is actually opposing Assange, saying, oh, Assange is terrible, blah, blah. So this is the sort of new way post-WikiLeaks that stuff is coming out, and it's very partial. So some people will be dished the dirt on, and other people will get off scot-free.
Okay, well, I have to ask you, John Bosnitch, what you meant by bribery, and tell us, if you can name names, and tell us overall what percentage of this money we're looking at is in the form of bribery.
Well, I don't think I'm opening any new doors of perception here. The fact of the matter is that a large number of the leading military and economic powers of this world today, of well-known, well-respected countries, are themselves the subject of an oligarchical power network inside their countries. And so these state leaders, these prime ministers and these presidents, are becoming more and more not the initiators of policy, but the presenters of policy. They are like a narrator of a film in which they themselves are not an actor. They play the part of head of state. They play the part of head of government. But in fact, they are being selected because they look good on camera. They are believable to the gullible population of the country, and they follow orders from their own domestic deep state, and be that America, England, France, or any other influential transnational entity, because these countries do not operate only within their own borders, but they use their own state as a base for raiding and controlling other states. This is the bigger aspect of this issue. It is not just a question of crooked politicians avoiding taxes. If it were, it would not be nearly the story that it is. This is a story of crooked politicians who are selected to be politicians because they're crooked before they even start. They are then placed into power using multi-million-dollar political campaigns, which are fine-tuned to deceive the public into picking one or more of the controlled political puppets. These puppets are then paid their bribes and their money under the table, which they then hide offshore. That is the entire scenario.
Tony Gosling, do you have a reaction? And if you do agree, who would be at the top of the list?
Well, the top of what list?
The top of the list of what description that John Bosnitch gave in terms of a politician, let's say.
Well, look, politicians are actually fairly low down the food chain. Obviously, the celebrities, they sell newspapers, and so there's a legitimate interest in them, and of course in the politicians because they're known faces. But at the top of the list, I mean, I think in terms of who we need to be keeping an eye on, and I'm not entirely sure that that's what's been going on here. People looking at those the most rich and most powerful who operate behind the scenes. We're talking really here about the pharmaceutical industry, big oil. Also, of course, the fintech sector, that financial technology, and the finance sector, the City of London, at Wall Street, all these kinds of characters. And I think the journalists aren't doing themselves any favours by concentrating, and there may well be other leaks that we've only just come across this massive dossier of people who are in these very rich and powerful positions. Those are the sorts of people who I would be much more interested to see them, because they like to stay in the shadows. And in fact, by concentrating on the sort of celebrity status of the people who are in these leaks, the journalists are almost playing their game. I mean, the Bureau of Investigative Journalists in London was run for a while by Ian Overton, and I remember having a conversation with him saying, well, look, when is the Bureau of Investigative Journalists going to look into the big questions there are around the 7/7 London bombings? And he told me, he said, well, actually, there's no need to do an investigation. We know exactly what happened. And this, I'm afraid, is the attitude amongst some of these organisations around the world that have got massive budgets, loads of journalists on their side, is they don't want to look into the really deep, dark crannies where where people like me, freelance journalists like myself, know that some of the most important facts lie. And so also we have to ask the question, where is these leaks from? Who has actually leaked them to these journalists? And I would suggest it's probably financial sector people and also possibly intelligence services, because if you look at the numbers of politicians, there's a definite bias towards the whole Western, anti-Russian, anti-Eastern European attitude. That is to say, various people around the world, including, by the way, this organisation, the ICIJ, did a whole leak very recently, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, looking at China through the prism of the Uyghurs, saying, oh, look, all these Uyghurs have given us all this information about how terrible the Chinese are. Well, this is just following, the Western geopolitical agenda. Right. And I have a real tendency to look at these big leaks. Yes, there's some fascinating information in there, but really just part of a anti-China, anti-Russian propaganda campaign.
Well, one of the things we need to talk about here, John Bosnitch, is, which the ICIJ mentioned, is how, and it called it one of the most troubling revelations, and it said is the U.S. and the role that South Dakota, Nevada, and other states had adopted in terms of financial secrecy and how they're being used as actually, in a sense, tax havens. It said rivaling those of offshore jurisdictions, and obviously revealing America's complicity in the matter. Tell us what your thoughts are on South Dakota, Nevada, and other states maybe that you can tell us in terms of the way it has served that purpose, which is offshore, an offshore economy, as it said.
Well, of course, these are euphemistically referred to as liberalized financial sectors in Nevada and other states in the United States. They use the word liberalized to suggest that there's some more form of freedom. Well, yes, there is more freedom, and that's the freedom to steal and to bribe and to coerce by financial means. The fact that there are these kinds of internal havens in the United States is merely a reflection of the fact that the United States is the physical and financial center of the Anglo-American empire, which grew out of the colonial empire of England. So this is just an old way of doing business. It was illegal, and it was permanently illegal in England and in the United States as they built their empire. But the judges and the prosecutors and the lawyers were paid and given status in society to look the other way. These things have now been leaked. It is a certainty that there are financial authorities involved in getting access to the leaked information and filtering it out to the public in a manner that's understandable. But it is even more likely and more certain that it is the interference in domestic Western affairs, these are their words, by Russian, Chinese, and other intelligence services who have discovered a treasure trove of the criminal activities of the leading investment bankers, the leading politicians, the leading public thinkers, and the leading communicators of the Anglo-American empire. And this is the crux of the matter. They not only choose to dominate the world anti-democratically and illegally by force of arms and by coercion, but after they dominate the world, they still don't even admit the amount of money that they take for themselves as just simple graft and bribery. And now that these data are being released, the entire lid is off of the matter, and the way things are done in the West and around the world should change. And journalists, and this is a comment that I join my fellow commentator in expressing today, is it's high time that journalists were journalists and not paid propagandists for the media owned by the oligarchies of the countries in which they live.
Well, I'm guessing, Tony Gosling, not guessing, but I'm thinking that this is a good thing that these types of revelations are being released.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And I want to come at you, Tony Gosling, if I may, through the span of what the ICIJ had in its report in terms of, for example, the offshore holdings. And it said offshore holdings of more than 130 billionaires from 45 countries. Now, when you have 130 billionaires who are not paying their taxes, according to Forbes, 100 of the billionaires had a collective fortune of more than $600 billion. Now, we're looking at that while millions across the world are living in poverty, okay? Especially now when COVID has hit. You're looking at 150 million people to have fallen into poverty. These taxes that they're not paying could be going towards nation building. So isn't that one way of looking at this?
Well, the trouble is at the moment, paying tax in many of the Western countries is simply something that goes on repayment of national debts. So it doesn't necessarily go to public services and spending here in the West anymore. After the 2008 bailouts, and also succeeding bailouts, much of the revenue that is taken in tax simply goes in debt repayments. And so this is, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't be getting the tax off these people. Of course we should. And in fact, for almost all those billionaires will be able to take half of their wealth away from them, and they wouldn't notice any difference whatsoever in their lifestyle. In fact, you could probably take 90% of their wealth away from them, and they wouldn't notice any difference in their lifestyle whatsoever. So that's the sort of excess wealth they've got. And of course, in any kind of just world, that wealth should be. I mean, for example, we're in a situation now, aren't we, where some of the super wealthy are just playing games with shooting rockets to the moon for space tourism. Your Richard Bransons, the Musks, etc. And this is because they've got far too much wealth and they've been able to keep it to themselves. And it's just a little kind of toy they're playing with. Of course, that wealth needs to be taken. But there is a much bigger side to this, as you've said, between the maldistribution of wealth, the perverse concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny number of people, and land, by the way, in the hands of a tiny number of people. And in order to do something about that, we have to do something about these tax, what they call secrecy jurisdictions, as John Christensen at the Tax Justice Network regularly talks about. He's just retiring, which is a shame to see. But, this is what they've been concentrating on. And in the Anglo-Zionist Empire, there is a battle going on right now, and that is a battle between the financial elite, the financial oligarchy, who largely are anonymous behind the scenes, and literally the democratic and media institutions which guarantee us our freedom. Those are on the back foot and they're losing. And I see this as possibly, anyway, another actual assault on our democratic institutions and some of our personalities that are behind media. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but also the timing is really interesting, very important here in the UK, where this has just happened at the cusp between last week's Labour conference and this week's Conservative conference. So all of the Labour donors will be being ignored, and all the Conservative donors, Conservative conference season, everyone's forgotten about the other side. So this is an assault on the Conservative, who are really the only people opposing internationalism at the moment here in Britain.
Okay. Last word to you, John Bosnitch. So a couple of statements there made by Tony Gosling said something should be done about it. Department of Justice in the U.S., other justice departments across the world looking at these troves and revelations. Why don't they jump at this and go after the ones who are evading taxes illegally?
Well, we go back to the conspiratorial nature of this entire subject matter. Yes, we've got oligarchs who have enriched themselves personally. They then effectively purchase politicians to use them as pawns in the further expansion of their wealth. And the last element of all of this, and it's the element that we've seen over the past 20 years in particular, is that once they've bought up the wealth and assembled the wealth as the richest people in the world, and they bought up their politicians and made them into personal assets, the last and most effective and destructive step is they buy up the media. The so-called lying mainstream media that President Trump used to refer to is
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I got to jump in because we're just fresh out of time. I do apologize for that. Let me thank our guest. Historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling spoke to us from Bristol, and you were just listening to John Bosnitch. Thank you, journalist and political analyst from Belgrade. That does it for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Kavitavwe, and the entire team. It's goodbye.